So GIACE is part of a wider programme supported by the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office that also encompasses SOAS ACE, that's at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, led by Mushtaq Khan, and SOC ACE, Serious Organised Crime ACE, led by Heather Marquette at the University of Birmingham. The core principles that underpin the ACE programme as a whole are that research should focus on anti-corruption, not explore how corruption operates and the damage that it does. That research should be problem and issue driven rather than offering any generic one-size-fits-all anti-corruption solutions. That it should address real-world priorities in specific sectors. That it should take politics and social context seriously and target politically viable reforms, and that it should engage policymakers and practitioners from nose to tail of the research process. In short, research undertaken through the ACE programme and GIACE in particular aims to be operationally relevant, problem-driven, rigorous, and actionable. The GIACE covers a number of themes, one of which is the international architecture that supports illicit financial flows. And under that theme, Dan Haberly ran a 2-year project that made use of leaked and newly constructed data sets to understand the impact that offshore financial secrecy reforms are having on the use of shell companies for the hiding of corrupt proceeds. The current report that is being launched today comes out of a follow-up project that we were pleased to fund earlier this year, allowing Dan to dig a bit deeper into some of the issues revealed in his initial work with GIACE. So Dan is Associate Professor in Human Geography in the Centre for Global Political Economy at the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex, and a member of the Centre for the Study of Corruption, also based at Sussex. He's published extensively on issues around offshore jurisdictions, globalization, and uneven development, including a recent book with Dariusz Wojciech called Sticky Power: Global Financial Networks in the World Economy, published by Oxford University Press. Dan will introduce his new report this afternoon with presentations of around about 15 minutes or so. And after Dan is done, I'll ask Erica Hanichak to offer some reflections and responses. Erica is the Government Affairs Director at the FACT Coalition's Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, where she leads the group's engagement with federal policymakers, particularly as it pertains to FACT's anti-money laundering priorities. An advocacy professional dedicated to improving US money laundering safeguards and mitigating global corruption, Erica has a long background of working with nonprofits focused on advancing transparent governance, accountability, and rule of law. So Erica is a 2022-2023 Ken Campbell Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and is an ACAMS certified anti-money laundering specialist. So after Erica has made her observations, we should then have plenty of time for a question and answer session. And hopefully this microphone will be a little bit better, particularly when Dan is talking. So I'm going to hand over to Dan now to give his presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Paul. So the report I'm presenting on today is called Corruption, Shell Companies, and Financial Secrecy, Providing an Evidence Base for Anti-Corruption Policy. It's co-authored with Tom Shipley and Robert Barrington, who are also at the University of Sussex in the Center for the Study of Corruption. So as Paul introduced, this has been funded now through 2 phases of GIACE funding from the UK FCDO, which aims to generate evidence-based anti-corruption research. Specifically, it's related to one of the priority areas, which aims at understanding the broader international architecture that enables corruption. So framing it as something that happens beyond the confines of just one particular state. So the part of this that we look at is specifically the role of offshore jurisdictions in the world economy, which is widely recognized in relation to enabling illicit financial flows in general, including in relation to corruption. And this recognition has prompted a growing number of national as well as international initiatives coordinated by bodies such as FATF, the OECD, European Union, aimed at policing IFFs and also more broadly improving financial transparency, particularly in offshore jurisdictions. And we know from a general standpoint, there's been quite a bit of success at actually implementing this agenda. At the same time that we don't have a particularly good or systematic understanding of what the actual impact of this IFF reform and financial transparency reform agenda has been. So from a big picture standpoint, this is essentially the overriding objective of the project. So how has tightened illicit financial flow regulation actually impacted the use of offshore jurisdictions for illicit financial flows? Essentially, our approach to analyzing this has two components. So number one, we've tried to construct the largest temporally continuous and temporally consistent in terms of methodology and measurements database of illicit financial flow regulations around the world. So this goes from 1990 to 2020. It's called the Regulation of Illicit Financial Flow, or RIFF database. Secondly, we brought this together with the Panama and Paradise Papers leak data and also various other bilateral international data sets and statistical analysis. In terms of the goals of this, we're essentially trying to, number one, help guide ongoing IFF regulation by taking stock of what the map of IFF regulatory change looks like today, which is actually not particularly well understood, actually, in terms of mapping out the trajectory of what's been done, but also systematically assessing the impacts of this policy. But also more broadly trying to understand, particularly making use of the leak data, what actually makes offshore company formation tick in terms of its use by developing and transition economy clients, particularly when we talk about the more sort of high risk, potentially corruption-linked uses of offshore companies. So the report itself focuses on a couple different aspects of the project. The first part is basically asking, what does the regulation of illicit financial flow database that we've constructed tell us about how the global IFF regulatory landscape has changed since 1990? And also, where does this landscape stand today from an anti-corruption standpoint specifically? Secondly, what can the leak data from the Panama and Paradise Papers tell us about the relationship between corruption and the use of offshore companies by actors in developing and transition economies? So specifically, what sort of patterns can we actually pull out statistically in a systematic way, as opposed to just sort of looking for particular case studies in the data? And finally, the overriding emphasis on all of this is, what does this tell us in terms of policy? So first, I talk about the first aspect of this. What does the RIFF data set tell us about how IFF regulation has changed worldwide since 1990? So just some background in the data set. So it covers 23 different indicators in 61 jurisdictions over a period of 30 years with annual time resolution across each of the indicators. And our key emphasis here is on making sure we're actually maintaining a consistent methodological approach to how we're coding each of these regulatory indicators year by year, and also annually updating them over this 30-year period. So you have actually some really good repositories already of IFF regulatory information, particularly the Tax Justice Network's Financial Secrecy Index or the FATF reports, but they're not coded in this temporally consistent or temporally continuous a way that allows you to, for example, feed them into a statistical analysis, or even really say how much better have things actually gotten in a particular place over time. For one thing, they tend to continuously move the goalposts, essentially raising the bar over time in terms of what's considered compliant. So it's very difficult to track with existing data sets what has actually changed. And so here we have to acknowledge really support from the Tax Justice Network, particularly the Financial Secrecy Index team, provided us with invaluable support in constructing this data set. So again, we've constructed this data set as 23 different indicators. What you see is, generally speaking, the overall trajectory of IFF regulatory change across most of the indicators is very highly correlated, to the extent that you can use what's called factor analysis to try to pull out basically what's the dominant shared dimension of variation across all the types of regulations. So construct what we call sort of a RIFF composite regulatory score. What you see if you push this back to 1990, the sort of overall state of AML, CTF, more broadly IFF regulation, is by present day standards, every place basically looks pretty terrible. So 1990, you're seeing sort of the early progress of the US-led war on drugs, sort of early movement towards money laundering criminalization. So you see a little bit of forward progress basically in big developed countries led by the US. As the 1990s go on, by the time you get to 2000, what you see is this initial movement, so sort of anti-drugs money laundering, eventually moving into counter-terrorist financing legislation, establishment of a sort of basic infrastructure with things like financial intelligence units. This basically makes progress in what you could call onshore economies, both developed and developing countries. Meanwhile, the offshore world tends to be left behind. So you see by the time you get to 2000 are sort of conspicuous red dots of lax regulation in offshore jurisdictions. What happens though, is as you move forward, by the time you get to around 2010, things start to change. So now you're starting to get into more sort of intensive client due diligence, KYC type regulations, beginnings of things like automatic information exchange with the EU Savings Directive, eventually moving into like things like beneficial ownership registers, the OECD Common Reporting Standard. And actually, by the time you get up to 2018, which is the most recent map you have, you actually see that the IFF regulatory landscape, at least in terms of the core sort of AML, CTF elements, has actually turned somewhat inside out. You see blue dots actually, offshore jurisdictions being somewhat more stringent in general in terms of, at least on paper, how they're applying the IFF regulatory framework than onshore jurisdictions. And so what you see if you look at the overall sort of regulatory gap between offshore jurisdictions and major OECD jurisdictions, what you see is the gap peaks in roughly the mid-1990s. This is when the major developed countries have started to implement an anti-money laundering framework. By the time you get to the last few years, though, it's actually inverted a little bit. The offshore jurisdictions are actually looking slightly better. Again, with the RIFF, we're mostly prioritizing the state of AML regulation, effectively nominally as it exists on paper. It's possible, though, to also try to understand what's being actually implemented at the service provider level by comparing it to another research project, which is the Global Shell Games Project. This is run by Findley, Nielsen, and Sharman. And what they did is actually effectively pretend to be clients of varying levels of suspiciousness. They called up service providers in a huge number of jurisdictions and basically looked at how diligently did they actually apply the AML framework. What you see is really interesting. So what we've done here, the x-axis is plotting our RIFF regulatory data set. This is the kind of nominal state of regulation on paper. The y-axis is the Global Shell Games compliance score actually observed. And the color coding, so the blue dots, these are tax havens that were deemed uncooperative by the OECD in the year 2000. What you see is they're very consistently actually disproportionately overperforming in terms of how the service providers are actually applying the AML, so the client due diligence framework. On the other hand, the big developed countries themselves, the OECD jurisdictions, which are coded in orange, are actually systematically underperforming. So sort of a real paradoxical pattern there. Keeping in mind this is 2010 when they collected their data. You see something similar actually with FATF membership, although not quite as extreme as what you see with OECD membership. It turns out, though, that there's a rub to this, which is that if you go outside of the scope of the sort of meat of what you could call the AML, counter-terrorist financing framework, things like client due diligence, and look more broadly at what you could actually call financial secrecy, then you actually still see an onshore-offshore divide. It just looks a bit different in the past. Interestingly, one thing that has not really been reformed is statutory banking secrecy. So the actual banking secrecy laws that in some cases impose harsh criminal penalties on disclosure of client data. Here you still see a pronounced onshore-offshore divide broadly in terms of where banking secrecy laws are applied, and also very little movement over time in terms of reform. So this is what the world map of statutory banking secrecy looked like in 1990. This is what it looked like in 2018. Incredibly little movement compared to what you see more broadly for the IFF regulatory framework. And what you see, interestingly, is banking secrecy has actually become almost completely decoupled from the broader landscape of IFF regulatory reform. So back in the mid-1990s, if a place had banking secrecy, you could also more or less predict it would have very lax regulations in terms of areas like AML, CTF, an R squared of sort of 28% there. By the time you get to 2018, though, the relationship between these two has completely disappeared. Another place where you see a sort of widening onshore-offshore discrepancy is in the transparency of beneficial ownership registers. So again, if you just look at who has adopted mandatory beneficial ownership registration, actually the offshore jurisdictions look, if anything, a little bit better than the OECD states. This is the top panel. If you look, though, at who has made their beneficial ownership registers public, what you see is offshore jurisdictions are almost always maintaining much more restrictive access to who is actually able to see this data. Sometimes a very small number of government officials, sort of very steep conditionalities, sort of limited situations on who can actually access this beneficial ownership data. So I think this question is, number one, why does this matter? So you have the offshore jurisdictions, so they're collecting more and more client data. They're also sharing it internationally, increasingly through automatic information exchange mechanisms. So for example, if you look at automatic information exchange, the EU Savings Directive and OECD CRS, again, you actually see the offshore jurisdictions as a group, if anything, outperforming the OECD states slightly. So again, in theory, this should counteract banking secrecy, beneficial ownership, access restrictions. The key thing, though, that we argue is when it comes to anti-corruption work, the problem is that the government's agencies that have access to this information, that can override banking secrecy, that can access the beneficial ownership registers, they're not the ones that are mostly taking the leadership in these investigations. It's mostly journalists, civil society organizations, various groups coming from outside of the government. And actually, in the extreme, you see that these sort of atavistic banking secrecy laws, which have persisted sort of almost unreconstructed underneath this landscape of reforms. Almost unreconstructed below this landscape of reform. In the extreme cases, these can actually be used to criminalize journalists and whistleblowers, to actually stop them from investigating outside of governmental channels. And also, again, beneficial ownership registers, I mean, it's all well and good if this exists theoretically, but if nobody can actually access it except under extreme restrictions, it's of no use to most of the organizations that are actually taking the initiative in anti-corruption work. So our argument is here that anti-corruption investigators outside of government, you shouldn't have to sit around and wait for the next data leak in order to pursue your investigation. Which brings us to the second part of this topic, which is what do the leaked data sets actually tell us about the link between corruption and the use of offshore companies in a systematic statistical sense. So there isn't time to go into a great deal of detail about the Panama and Paradise Papers. Suffice it to say, it's an incredibly rich and complicated, but also very sort of difficult to use database statistically. It covers hundreds of thousand companies over a period of sort of 20 plus years when you have relatively good data. Again, it's very difficult to use statistically, but it also has advantages. One of the advantages in comparison to virtually all other data sets of companies, particularly over this time period, is that we know for a fact it has an incredibly good cross-section of politically exposed persons, offshore shell company use. A lot of cases linked to known major international corruption cases. This map is showing basically the percent of all offshore companies linked to clients in a country that are linked to known politically exposed persons. So I'm not sure if you can see the scale, but the dark red, that's 20% or higher of all offshore companies. So a lot of these countries you've seen, even just the ones that are known from ICIJ's investigation, you've seen a double-digit percentage of the whole universe of offshore companies. You also have incredibly rich geographic information about the structure of these companies. And so what we've done here is mapped out various geographic levels of the architecture of all of the known PEP-link shell companies in the Panama and Paradise Papers. So there's three different levels here. Firstly, the color-coded circles, these are the regions where the clients are based, the countries. So you've got brown for the Middle East, yellow sub-Saharan Africa, green Latin America, orange Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the dark gray circles, these are the jurisdictions where the actual offshore companies are formed or incorporated. You notice it's very heavily concentrated above all the British Virgin Islands, a couple of other UK overseas territories like Bermuda, Cayman Islands. Panama also shows up as fairly large. Again, not necessarily representative as leaked data, but generally speaking, BVI is a very important place in this. Finally, what you also have is the location where the offshore companies are administered by the service provider. These are the light gray circles in the figure, which are between the client jurisdictions and the incorporation jurisdictions. Here is actually the most concentrated geographic level. Effectively, you see the city of London and Geneva are effectively intermediating the lion's share of these flows, along with a few other places like Miami for Latin America, Hong Kong for East Asia, Dubai for the Middle East, for example. So what we've tried to do is systematically pull out statistically what are sort of concrete empirical signals of potentially corruption-linked high-risk offshore company use that we can identify. And our methodology here is sort of a series of large-scale panel regression analyses of data from 1991 to 2015. I think it's very, very tricky to do because it's leaked data. The key to doing this rigorously is to take advantage of the fact that you have multiple leaked data sets which can be used to conduct robustness checks against one another, since you don't necessarily know the biases of any one of them. And effectively what we've done is not put any stock in any one model, and instead run actually hundreds of different models and look at how stable the results are across the sensitivity analysis. So in terms of our findings, the first thing we find is that political and institutional shocks have a huge impact on offshore company formation, developing and transition economies. It's also very strongly conditioned by a country's level of corruption. So what I'm showing here, again, what we've done is run a very large number of different models with sensitivity analysis to see how stable are the results. This is summarizing how consistently the statistically significant positive result on the right side, as opposed to a statistically significant negative result on the left side. It is separated out relatively low corruption developing countries in blue and high corruption in orange. And we see there's a lot of things where there's a really sharp, sort of these diametrically opposed divide between countries on the basis of corruption level. The first place you see this is regime change. So you might think when a regime collapses, you'd see a burst of offshore company formation for capital flight. It turns out that you only see this in relatively low corruption developing countries. In highly corrupt countries, you see the mirror image. You actually see offshore company formation is high all of the time that a regime is in power, and it actually collapses when the regime is out of power. So it effectively looks like corrupt regimes are effectively stashing wealth offshore all the time, to the extent that it's effectively dominating the offshore company formation of the respective countries to large extents. This is a result that we find more than 90% of all models.
So just to understand, you observe companies closing or only opening? So
Drop in
is
formation.
less opening?
Yeah. So the formation drops off.
Formation, but
Yeah.
not that. Don't know if they close the company.
Yeah. So it's looking at company formations. The other place where you see a very sharp divide between countries on the basis of corruption level is the impact of liberalization reforms. So in developing countries with relatively low corruption, you actually see offshore company formation actually drops a little bit during liberalization. In highly corrupt countries, though, it does the opposite. Offshore company formation spikes when liberalizing institutional reforms are being implemented. What's really counterintuitive and somewhat disconcerting about this, though, is where the spike appears to be coming from. You might think it would be coming overwhelmingly from things like the privatization of state assets. It turns out, though, statistically, where it seems to be coming from, where you control for things like capital account opening, is actually building a stronger legal framework of private property rights and rule of law. So actually, when the coding of the basic sort of institutional framework of a market economy is getting stronger in the context of liberalization, that's when you actually see offshore company formation spike and go crazy, but only in countries that are highly corrupt. You don't see this in low corruption countries. It's a sort of highly counterintuitive, but also highly disconcerting effect. So in other words, when they're trying to make the institutions better is actually when you see more money actually being moved offshore. Interestingly, privatization, state ownership, you see the opposite effect. Actually, in countries, regardless of corruption, offshore company formation tends to be high when the state sector is large and to fall when it shrinks. But we found, though, that seems to have very little to do with actually economic policy. It seems to be almost entirely have to do with the fact that the size of the state sector in most developing countries is effectively controlled by mineral rents. So what you're actually seeing is when the state sector is large, that's usually because more mineral rents are being mediated offshore. When it shrinks, it's usually because revenue is falling. So again, some really highly counterintuitive results. What we also see more broadly, if you take any kind of inflow of foreign currency, not just mineral rents, but also foreign aid, the IMF assistance, and basically inject it into a country, sort of irrespective of the local investment opportunities. Some part of that seems to get recycled back offshore into shell companies. What's interestingly, though, is unlike the institutional and political effects, this does not really seem to be impacted by a country's level of corruption. It's more like if you're sort of artificially injecting foreign currency inflows, some part of that seems to get recycled offshore. It looks more like a kind of macroeconomic effect in terms of the relative incentives of portfolios. Interestingly, though, out of all of the effects we find, the strongest driver of offshore company formation by developing and transition economies is not actually in the economies themselves. It's actually what's going on in the leading developed country financial markets, and above all, New York and London. So what this is showing here, the black line is basically the worldwide formation of developing transition economy offshore companies in leaked data sets. The red lines, this is an equally weighted index of UK real estate and the New York stock market. So the sort of two traditionally most attractive markets that are likely to be absorbing as well. The R squared of the relationship between the two is actually 92%. High. And even if you look at the year-on-year wiggles in this, so sort of control for autocorrelation effects, you still see that 40% of the total behavior, like year-on-year change in offshore company formation by developing countries is effectively controlled by what's happening with the financial markets in New York and London. This is inextricably intertwined, essentially, with sort of core of the global financial system, sort of Anglo-America, center to that. Again, this is actually larger than the combined explanatory power of everything that's going on within developing countries themselves. Right. So in terms of overall conclusions and impacts, the first thing I would say is there seems to be a kind of a mismatch that's emerged between the logic of the IFF regulatory framework as sort of advanced by FATF, OECD, on the one hand, and the requirements of anti-corruption accountability on the other. Again, the overwhelming emphasis of the IFF regulatory framework is really on governmental access to information and the ability of governments to share information with each other. Again, the problem with this is the primary initiative behind most anti-corruption work. It's not usually by governments. Sometimes it is, but that's sort of not usually the case, particularly outside of the efforts of US law enforcement. Instead, it's non-governmental actors, journalists and law enforcement, or journalists, civil society organizations that are usually taking the initiative and exposing things which law enforcement will then pick up later. What this means, we argue, is that the traditional IFF regulatory framework needs to be reframed in a much broader way that enables sort of broad public foundations of how governmental accountability actually works. It can't just be in terms of governments sharing information through these narrow intergovernmental mechanisms, particularly when you're talking about highly corrupt kleptocratic states, when you effectively have a catch-22. In some cases, you would be effectively handing them sole initiative to investigate themselves through the way some of these things are structured. Again, public availability of data is really critical to this, especially benefit ownership data. You shouldn't have to wait for data leaks for non-governmental investigators to look into things. But also more broadly, there seems to be a growing need for vigilance in what you could call non-governmental financial secrecy. In other words, financial secrecy that is something overridden by government mechanisms, but it can still be enforced by anybody who's not within sort of government law enforcement within these particular mechanisms. What's particularly important here, so it has a particularly disproportionate effect on journalists and civil society, but it also actually affects government themselves. So if governments, for example, can only share information through specific mechanisms, jumping through sort of, they just lodge a request, wait for a return, that's effectively going to slow down the process even by government themselves of investigating things. It's much easier if it's all just openly accessible on a website free of charge, particularly if you're talking about beneficial ownership. The next sort of conclusion is, again, highly corrupt versus less corrupt developing and transition economies show very different pattern of offshore company formation. In less corrupt countries, offshore company formation spikes when the regime is collapsing. It dips when there's liberalization. Again, highly corrupt countries, you basically see the opposite. It's high all the time that the regime is in power, moving money offshore. Shell company formation collapses when the regime collapses. Again, the other hand, when liberalization happens, offshore company formation goes crazy, where the sort of very counterintuitive and disconcerting thing, again, it doesn't seem to be linked to privatization, but actually the building of what you would think would be the strong institutions that should control corruption, actually the strengthening of private property rights framework and rule of law seems to be, at least statistically, what's very robustly linked to this. It's a highly disconcerting finding. I would say the takeaway is paradoxically, from a general rule of thumb, you actually need to be most cautious in advocating a good governance reform agenda in precisely those places where it's most sorely needed. Because those are also precisely the places where the agenda itself is most likely to be hijacked and abused and have unintended consequences. Finally, the conclusion I'll leave with is to observe that the offshore system is profoundly concentrated, particularly when you look at the fact that there's a high degree of geographic specialization in terms of who's dealing with particular sorts of activities at different stages of the sort of assembly line of offshore companies with respect to particular regions. And it actually looks even more concentrated when you look at the fact that most of the jurisdictions that we're talking about fall within the umbrella of effectively 3 national or supranational governments. So either US states, UK overseas territories and dependencies, or EU member states are effectively the vast majority of the system that we're talking about. What's important about this, and again, to a large extent, the ebb and flow of these companies, it reflects the fact that this money is sort of deeply entangled effectively with developed country financial markets. From a reform standpoint, I think the key thing to recognize here is that there really is no substitute for this centralized core of jurisdiction. So if you're talking about any one sort of small offshore island, it can maybe be substituted. When you're talking about as a network of the sort of UK plus all of its overseas territories, plus the United States and the EU, it effectively has a lock structurally on the core of the global financial system, which means effectively you have a tremendous amount of leverage to implement reform without having to worry about money going to some other financial center. The reason being there is no other financial center that can absorb this at any large scale, effectively because you effectively need a strong democratic state with strong rule of law and strong institutions to host a credible financial center. So it gives you sort of an inherent strength sort of leverage to push through sort of open liberal reform agenda, but also imposes a substantial amount of responsibility on the states at the heart of the system because they have such an entrenched position of leadership that really puts an obligation on them. So I'll conclude here. Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. As you can tell from that really fascinating presentation, this is a really rich, detailed, and informative, as well as eye-opening report. And I strongly urge anybody who hasn't yet downloaded it or got a copy of it, make sure you do and have a read of it. Erica, of course, had a chance to see it beforehand, and so she's going to offer some commentary and some response from the perspective of her position in the FACT Coalition. So, Erica.
Hello there, everyone. Thank you all for having me today. And Dan, congratulations on this report. It's very needed to have this understanding over time about how systems around the world, and I'm speaking from a U.S. perch as part of a U.S. advocacy coalition, but to understand how these reforms that we're so involved in and advocating for, studying, assessing, are changing over time. So thank you for your thought leadership on this and for the opportunity to talk today. So the report that we've talked about today really does highlight an interesting trend that worldwide jurisdictions are moving better in a better direction on the regulations on the books, but that financial secrecy is very high. And you couldn't have teed me up better with that last point on your last slide that that for countries that are leading the global financial system just per force of history of some of the economics, that they need to take a stronger role in leading on reform. And for that very reason, that's why I'll be talking a little bit about the U.S. Context. Again, it's the perch on which I sit, but also it's critical that the United States as destination for both licit and illicit finance that we are in a leadership role rather than a laggard role in leading on some of these reforms. And I say this also knowing that we are very much in a laggard position when it comes to what's on the books, but also in our enforcement in many ways. And there's a lot of implications of this report about what the U.S. needs to focus on in conjunction with its international allies to be able to actually contribute to the mission of countering corruption and countering crime. In the U.S. context, let's just, for those who may not be as familiar, the U.S. is actually the world's lead supplier of financial secrecy. It's a Tax Justice Network finding from their financial secrecy index from last year. The U.S. Treasury Department actually estimates that the equivalent of 2% of U.S. GDP in illicit finance moves through our system every year. That's about $460 billion. Especially as we talk about, many of us just came from the World Bank, anti-corruption for development. We see huge sums of money coming from certain countries in the world to others in the form of aid for governance, for anti-corruption, for democracy and human rights. And in the United States, we look at the US aid budget, and I think that totaled about $50 billion in previous cycles, most recently. So again, this amount of illicit finance that's just finding home in the US itself is enormous and dwarfing the amount that we're actually able to put in and invest. So if we're able to counter illicit finance, then we can actually do a better job at supporting the goals of development. And our Treasury Secretary said that as much basically is that right now the U.S. is likely the best place in the world to hide ill-gotten gains. So the U.S. is taking some steps. I would like to say that I completely agree that pretty much there's equivalent of how we're doing on regulatory reforms worldwide. I hate to say that the U.S. is behind the times on this, on the regulatory frameworks that we need to put in place. There's been important steps, however. The U.S. Strategy on Countering Corruption, which came out in 2021, did lay out a really strong framework, not only for how the U.S. can support anti-corruption initiatives internationally, but also to clean up our own backyard. We might not be the traditional offshore secrecy jurisdiction like the Cayman Islands or British Virgin Islands, but we are, again, the world's largest supplier of financial secrecy. And a big move toward that has been implementing our own beneficial ownership directory through the Corporate Transparency Act. So this has been a key anti-money laundering reform, more than 20 years really in the making. And one big important piece of the puzzle to help law enforcement and financial institutions do a better job of countering illicit finance, both the criminal kind and the corrupt kind. But there are other places where we need to be doing more as well. Right now, the administration is moving forward some steps to tackle money laundering through the $50 trillion real estate and $11 trillion private investment markets. We're actually expecting a rule on the real estate market, hopefully sometime this fall. Private investment is still forthcoming, but this is also a critical gap. And particularly speaks, I think, to Dan's point about how we see money flowing and the tracking of entity formation alongside asset markets globally that are, financially important. And especially U.S. asset markets like real estate and private investment are really key for us to be following, not only in terms of tracking the entity formation, how that money is finding its way into the U.S., but also making sure there's transparency that's when it's here, we can actually route it out, the funds that are illicit and dirty. And then finally, also just to point this out before moving on, the U.S. is still behind the times on having due diligence obligations for professional gatekeepers, enablers. The legislation in Congress that would tackle this got pretty far last year and has really good bipartisan support toward moving forward. So it's just a matter of making sure that the U.S. can finally roll out some critical changes to make sure that professional enablers are actually brought under U.S. anti-money laundering law. Right now, I think it's us in Australia that don't have some of these provisions in place. Not a great look for the United States. But that said, is that the United States also says some key things and some key steps to take in terms of its own banking secrecy. While our banking secrecy laws may not be quite as stringent as Switzerland or some other places, we're more known for cracking down on journalists that are leaking some of this information, again, in the interest of transparency, there is still more that we can do to support the overall push toward anti-corruption, not just have this limited lens on law enforcement. And a big finding from the report is, again, the need for public beneficial ownership directories. The U.S. directory, unfortunately, is not a public directory. There are some provisions under which not just law enforcement, but financial institutions, regulators, foreign law enforcement can have access to the information of the U.S. directory. those could be a lot better. And so we've inputted into the US process ways that they can strengthen those information sharing systems, particularly with international allies. But that's still something that's at play, and we're expecting a final decision on that from Treasury in the fall. But still, there are some important steps that we need to take to make sure that there is more common access, again, for journalists, civil society that are doing the real hard work of putting the pieces together in these investigations. So that's why it's been really exciting actually to see news out of New York, for those who might have been following, where the New York State Legislature actually just approved the LLC Transparency Act, which would require entities, LLCs, either formed in New York State or that are registered to do business there, require them to name their true beneficial owner to a public directory at the State Secretary of State's office. And this is the first public beneficial ownership directory that would be in place in the US. So it's passed the legislature, it's just awaiting the signature of the governor, but we are hopeful that she'll sign that in the next few weeks. So that's an enormous step forward, trying to counteract some of these secrecy, embedded secrecy provisions that are on the books in the United States. So there's things to be happening at the federal level, but also at the subnational level. So let me stop there on that, but then let me just talk about one last thing in terms of something else that the report mentioned in terms of the implementation gap. The report rightly points to a couple of key problems when we look specifically at OECD countries in how these laws are actually implemented, not just what's on the books, but how we can take that next step forward. And a key point that the report makes is around resourcing, especially as we've studied a little bit more in the United States, in the UK, and other OECD countries. There's been such a dearth of resourcing for these types of provisions that would really push forward both an anti-corruption and law enforcement goal of rounding out illicit finance. For those who haven't looked at it yet, last year Transparency International put out a really good report called Up to the Task that actually does a study of how underfunded ultimately financial intelligence units are across several countries, and really points to this problem that we currently have here in the United States, where our financial intelligence unit both writes the rules and helps financial institutions and other key partners implement the rules to help protect our financial system. And right now, that financial intelligence unit, FinCEN, is facing 13% cuts from Congress to its budget. And so this is absolutely vital that we actually put our money where our mouth is. If we have an anti-corruption strategy, we say we want to do domestic anti-corruption reforms that will have international global impact, then we actually have to resource that accordingly. And again, this has huge opportunities to improve our regulations. We have new regulations that will actually counter illicit finance. It'll lead to better enforcement, not only for giving law enforcement more money, but more tools and better training on how to incorporate this information into their investigations, and then better processes. The report also calls out how there's a lot of customer due diligence regimes that are on the books that are more procedurally oriented rather than outcomes driven. So again, tracking down the bank to make sure it files the piece of paper rather than actually understanding that the piece of paper has any information or intelligence that's actually worth sharing. And so when the Corporate Transparency Act passed, another act, the Anti-Money Laundering Act, also passed to help improve private-public partnerships and feedback loops to make sure that we're actually working together between the private and public sector to improve information, rather than, again, just checking the box and moving on and just, we've been compliant and we're on our way. Let me see, there's maybe one or two more points I'll make. I think it really is, this report has really challenged how we think about entity formation in the democracy space and the governance space. And it's been something we've been thinking about a lot, in fact, about how we can better drive transparency reforms to better service broader goals that are common within our community here, goals that we're all committed to at the Open Gov Hub, including making sure that we're supporting a better green transition, fighting climate injustice, but also helping our partners in other parts of the world, again, better govern and be able to be in systems in which they can better govern themselves, and instead of being loaded down, for instance, in the African continent with debt. And so I think a lot of the lessons from this report will help feed into not only US policy, but international thinking on how we approach some of these systems and improve how we actually build our strategy on countering corruption. And core among this, again, is making sure that internationally that we have strong public beneficial ownership databases, that we push back on the increasing threat of secrecy and threat of false claims of privacy, like we've seen from the European Court of Human Rights on the beneficial ownership database in the EU. That now there's much more limited sharing of that information with civil society and journalists. Still there, but much harder to get access to. And these prevent those types of challenges too that are currently happening in the United States against the Corporate Transparency Act. And then again, what are the lessons that we can learn on the government side for better information sharing? So, with the crackdown on illicit finance from Russian oligarchs in response to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, what are the lessons that we can learn to actually share information in real time rather than submit requests and have to wait 2 years for something else to come down the pike? And then finally, I'll just say, when we look outside government, we have to do a better job, first of all, to make sure that we're building a proper enabling environment, that funders are investing in this type of work, not just for the, sexy, 1 to 2 to 5 year wins, but this is actually something that we can look at for the 5, 10, 20 year long horizon. Because this is something that truly does undercut every single issue that we're working on in our time. And then also that we're doing a better job of establishing connections to other communities, again, within the climate justice space or within the development space. So why don't I stop there? We'll talk about some questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Erica, for those insightful remarks. The way this normally works, of course, as you know, is I would now ask Dan and Erica a series of questions, and then when there's 20 seconds left, I'd say we've got time for one question from the audience. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to open the floor right now. And so if anybody has any questions, please show your hand. And for those of you who are watching online, we've only got one microphone. So when I take some questions, I'm going to have to walk over with the microphone to the person who's asking. So please, when you get the microphone, introduce yourself and then ask your question. I'm going to start over here.
Thanks very much, Dan and Erica. I'm a big fan of the work, Dan, as you know, and your flow map in terms of the flows of the BVI in the middle, I found has been one of the most influential graphics I've ever used. I've used it many times in terms of with various government donors, etc., saying, look at this, and people always look at it intently and then trace the finger on it and say, oh wow. So I say graphics breakthrough, so we're more pleased. And then on Erica's point about the commitment to development and aim is the revenues and losses impacted by many rich countries on other countries. So we talked about this a bit earlier in terms of the
hard to do this on a phone.
Development, and I see it like an iceberg. And many government donors that I speak to, they like looking at other governments' icebergs, but they rarely want to look at their own. But I wonder if you would elaborate more about whether we can have more of these conversations about the whole picture in terms of countering corruption versus enabling corruption, and how we can be a bit more frank and honest about any country, any sovereign entity's contribution, both in the sort of the plus side and the negative side. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Simon from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. I was wondering whether there was any sort of trends relating to the leaked databases, as in impact they had on the jurisdictions in which people are forming these entities, whether there was a shift from, say, Panama and BVI as a result of these leaks to other, maybe more secure, more private jurisdictions as a result.
Thank you. I'll take a series of questions, comments, and then we'll see.
I had a question that relates to more of a market segment kind of issues. And I want to get your feedback on it, specifically, investments in, especially, maybe dark money investments in sports leagues and so on, sports series. Internationally, of course, Formula One has interesting problems, perhaps, the way to look at that. Is there anyone who's specifically looking at sort of the dark money flows into sports?
Thank you. Any others? Oh, sorry.
I pose a question, St. Mary University and the Government Transparency Institute. You hear me? Yeah. So great fan of the work and great to see it evolve over the years, I would say. So also congratulations on working with hugely messy data. I just want to say this because people jump over this, but this is the hardest part, and probably that's where you spend most of your time. So it's congratulations for that. But I have a question about the sample, and I know I posed this question several times, so I want to pose it again. So this is a biased sample, right? And then in science, we don't like biased samples for obvious reasons, because they're biased, right? So one way to kind of alleviate our concerns that basically the conclusions are founded on biased data is to tell us how biased they are. And I know we run a lot of models, that's great, but something like which offshore centers are not in the leagues, right? There are a lot of others which we know they are. They haven't seen a single powerful IT person who's coming forward and sending us the files. And then within the centers themselves, right? These financial secret places, this is law firms basically, right? That's the unit of analysis of the league, right? So within those places, how biased are your samples? So when you say BVI, you probably mean one or two law firms. So these few law firms, how kind of biased sample they are of BVI and other places. So these two major sources of bias, I would be able to hear a bit more about, and how they detect the results or how.
Thanks, Ishi. I'm going to go back to Dan and Erica at this point, unless you need me to stall whilst you think of your response. But
Right, so the first question, first, thanks, Peter. Secondly, the question about the impact of the leaked data sets. Yeah, I haven't done research on this, but other people have. And I believe it has had an impact, the leaks themselves and subsequent. There has been a bit of research on this. In terms of the dark money in sports, I guess one question is, what do you mean by dark money? Because if you look at the British football teams, it's all pretty much in plain view. If you look at who is sort of buying control of them and where it's coming through. I mean, the sort of usual suspects, a lot of the stuff comes through Cyprus, for example, for Russia, at least before it gets frozen. I don't know of anyone who specifically looked at this, though. It would be interesting.
It specifically as, for example, sponsorship of Formula One racing in developing countries that obviously has to be someone's of very high wealth in those developing countries are facilitating races in certain areas where that makes sense for motor racing to happen elsewise.
I don't know. I mean, my impression of the sports thing is actually almost the opposite. It's related to sort of thing John Huddleshaw's work. He talks about reputational laundering, where they actually want as much visibility as possible to actually make themselves look better. So this way, people and state entities plastering their name all over everything deliberately and buying these as trophy assets, actually to show themselves off as opposed to hiding themselves. Seems to be. I don't know. There may also be a sort of dark money, but I'm not familiar as much with that sort of aspect of things. In terms of the sample bias, I mean, there's only so much you could do. I would say the key thing is every single model. I mean, so the fact that separate leaks from the Panama and Paradise papers, and you can essentially run everything differently on the two samples combined as opposed to separately with sort of fixed effects controls. And what you see is for the really big effects, you see the same results. for the Panama and Paradise Papers. So, I mean, there's only two good data sets, but at the same time, they're very different sorts of law firms. After being Mossack Fonseca, they deal with sort of different sorts of clients. And if you're saying the same effects effectively with these with regime change and institutional shocks across this, obviously there's a bit of uncertainty, but the chances of that are pretty infinitesimal, given that we've seen something like a 90% plus consistency in what the models are saying across the data. So I'd say some of the results are a little bit open, like I put much stock in, where sometimes they don't. But like the real thing, the institutional effects, the regime change effect, you see really pretty close agreement. You can say that's the sort of
That's good.
confidence.
We need to at some point be able to find this Zoom on my computer and download a paper.
What?
I'm gonna need to.
Talk both about the dark money feeding into the human rights abuses, but also into the decision making that, you know, obviously led to Qatar being chosen as the host country. And so happy to talk more with you about that at some point. And then Peter, is it to your point about having some honest conversations about fighting corruption at the same time that we're enabling corruption? I think we're really entering sort of a new era of being able to talk about that. I think one of the reasons it's even in some of the parlance right now is because you know, there's been more humility, I think, from certain countries that understand their role to play in enabling corruption. So, for instance, we've had some conversations and been to events with the State Department's anti-corruption coordinator, Richard Nephew. And he said that every conversation he goes into with other countries to talk about anti-corruption and what they can do, he always leads with the first comment that we know we have a problem, we're working on it. And again, the first way to solve a problem is to admit you have one in the first place. So I think there's been a good level of humility on that, but I don't think it's happening in enough circles, enough places, more widely. And it's been more of a name and shame, you know, looking also at the UK real estate market. And how many exposés there have been that have finally started to drive some reforms in that sector and some more transparency. But we need to have a better conversation about, you know, where does this money go and how are we playing a role? The last thing I'll mention is just the view from the Hill, because I am a government affairs person, is that this has been an effective argument for fiscal conservatives to say, you know, again, we talk about, we want to know where this money is going, but we have to understand how this money is coming in also. And sometimes it ends up being cyclical. We send money into these jurisdictions in the form of aid. It gets ransacked, piled up and bottled up and shipped right back into the United States. And it's sitting in a private equity account in downtown Manhattan. Like it doesn't really make sense if we're talking out both sides of our mouths. We have to walk the walk. I have one other comment, but it has slipped my mind, so I will think harder.
Thank you very much. Well, those of us who were at the AC4D event at the World Bank earlier, of course, we were reminded that time marches on, rather ominous, but it's true for us as well. And I'm afraid we are out of time for this session. So I'd like to thank Dan in particular and Erica for a superb presentation, a fantastic report, some wonderful and thought-provoking responses to it. I'd like to thank all of you for coming to be here this afternoon, for the questions and the insightful comments. And outside, there are some drinks and some food that you're all very welcome to join us in enjoying, but before you do that, please, could I ask you to show your appreciation in the normal way? Thank you very much.